Somewhere at the very top of mainland Scotland, past the last farmhouse, past the last stretch of open moor, there is a signpost. Tourists line up for hours just to take a photo next to it. It might be the single most photographed object in the entire country. And in 2010, a panel of judges looked at the town standing behind that signpost and officially declared it the most dismal town in all of Scotland. The town didn't argue. It didn't apologize. Nobody could even be found to accept the award. That's where we're ending today, at number 1. But before we get there, at number 2, I'm going to show you a town whose humiliation didn't just make headlines. It ended a 25-year-old tradition for good, and if you already know Scottish news, you might be able to guess which one I mean before we even get there. This isn't a list built on comment sections or angry TripAdvisor reviews, and it isn't built on my own opinion either. Every town on this countdown was formally judged, in writing, by a real panel for a real award that ran in Scotland for a quarter of a century. It started in the year 2000, and it grew out of a single sentence spoken by then Prince Charles back in the 1980s. When he described a proposed extension to London's National Gallery as a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend. That line spun off into an annual Scottish prize with a trophy shaped like a giant pimple made of Play-Doh, officially called the Pluck on the Plinth, awarded each year by the architecture magazine Urban Realm to whichever town the judges decided had fallen the furthest. Some towns fought back. Some towns embraced it. And one town's reaction in 2025 was so explosive that it shut the whole thing down. So if you're the type who likes uncomfortable true stories about the places people actually live, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because I want to know something before we start counting down. Drop your country or your city in the comments, because I have no idea where in the world you're all watching this from tonight, and I'd genuinely like to know. Now, let's count them down. Number 12. Airdrie. Airdrie in North Lanarkshire holds a strange kind of historical footnote. It was the very first winner. Back in 2000, when the Pluck on the Plinth was invented, judges needed somewhere to try it out on. And Airdrie beat out Cumbernauld, Campbelltown, Ardrossan, and Balloch for the dishonor. There was no elaborate ceremony, no widespread outrage, just a quiet, almost experimental verdict that Scotland's newest shame award needed a face, and Airdrie's town centre was it. What makes Airdrie interesting isn't dramatic decline or a single tragic event. It's that the town became the baseline. Every single town that came after it on this list was measured, in some sense, against the standard Airdrie accidentally set. It was the guinea pig for 25 years of judgment that followed. And once that verdict landed, the award needed somewhere new to go the following year, which brings us to a town that would end up winning this thing not once, but twice. Number 11. Denny. Denny sits in Falkirk Council area, and its story starts with a building called Church Walk, a rundown commercial and residential complex constructed in 1970 that came to dominate the town's center for decades. By 2010, residents were staging actual protests over its condition. A local campaigner named Brian McCabe put it bluntly to reporters. The town center, he said, looked like Beirut on a bad day. That same year, the Pluck on the Plinth was originally awarded to a completely different town, one we'll get to at number 1, but that town flatly refused to accept it. So the judges passed the trophy down to the runner-up, and Denny did something almost nobody else on this list did. It said yes. McCabe accepted the award on the town's behalf, in good spirits, using the unwanted spotlight to push Falkirk Council toward actually doing something about Church Walk. It's a rare example of a town using public shame as leverage instead of running from it. But not every winner handled the moment with that kind of grace, and our next entry didn't handle it at all. Number 10. Coatbridge. Coatbridge, also in North Lanarkshire, won the award outright in 2007. And when the time came for the presentation, something happened that tells you everything about how this town felt about the honor. Nobody showed up. No council representative, no community group, no local figure willing to stand next to the pimple-shaped trophy and smile for the cameras. The award simply sat there, unclaimed, a title nobody in Coatbridge wanted attached to their name in print. It's one thing to be told your town center has failed. It's another thing entirely for the silence that follows to become the headline itself. That empty podium became, in its own strange way, more talked about than an acceptance speech would have been. Coatbridge just went quiet and hoped it would pass. Our next town didn't have that luxury because its decline was written into the very cars it used to build. Number 9. Linwood. Linwood, in Renfrewshire, once had genuine industrial pride. It was the manufacturing base for the Hillman Imp, a British-built car that rolled off Linwood's assembly lines for years and gave the town a reason to exist beyond being a Glasgow commuter suburb. When the factory closed, that reason went with it, and the town's shopping centre, once billed as Scotland's very first, slid into decay. Linwood had already been dragged into national controversy once before, after a recruitment ad campaign nicknamed the town in a way locals found humiliating, and the label stuck around far longer than the campaign itself ever did. By 2011, when Linwood won the Pluck on the Plinth over Fort William and Nairn, judges described a decrepit, decaying town center stuck in limbo while a major retailer deliberated over whether to even bother redeveloping the site. One line from the judging panel stuck with locals for years afterward. Scotland's first shopping center is also its worst, leaving Linwood as a town without a heart. That's not a throwaway insult. That's a factual description of a building that used to be a point of civic pride, sitting empty and half forgotten in a town that used to build cars for the entire country. Our next entry has an even stranger irony baked into its origin story, because this next town was built for an industry that failed before the town was even finished. Number 8. Glenrothes. Glenrothes, in Fife, was designated as one of Scotland's earliest post-war new towns, planned out in 1948 with a specific purpose: to house miners who were going to work at a brand new coal mine called the Rothes Colliery. Streets were laid, homes were built, an entire town was engineered around this one industrial promise. Then the mine failed early, and Glenrothes had to reinvent itself as an electronics and industrial hub instead, eventually becoming part of what people called Scotland's Silicon Glen. That reinvention worked for a while. But by 2009, when Glenrothes beat out both New Cumnock and Motherwell for the Pluck on the Plinth, judges pointed to a depressed, investment-starved town center that hadn't kept pace with the rest of the town's recovery. A place engineered from scratch for one industry, forced to survive the collapse of that industry, only to be told decades later that its center still hadn't caught up. That's a very particular kind of civic whiplash. And speaking of towns that fell from a height nobody expected, our next entry is the one that shocked the country the most, because it isn't some forgotten mining village. It's one of Scotland's 4 major cities. Number 7. Aberdeen. Aberdeen is the Granite City, the historic capital of Scotland's oil industry, a place with financial weight and 1,000 years of recorded history behind it. So when Aberdeen won the 2015 Pluck on the Plinth over Cumbernauld, East Kilbride, and Leven, it made national news in a way smaller towns never could. Urban Realm's editor at the time, John Glenday, said Aberdeen had become the poor relation of Scotland's cities, despite its financial clout and rich heritage. Judges pointed specifically to stalled projects like Union Terrace Gardens and Marischal Square, and to the sting of Aberdeen missing out on the shortlist for UK City of Culture in 2017. Aberdeen's council pushed back hard, insisting progress was well underway and that the city was ambitious and historic. But the damage of the headline had already landed, and it traveled well beyond Scotland's borders, picked up by national papers that rarely bothered covering smaller towns on this list at all. This wasn't a struggling village nobody had heard of. This was one of Scotland's wealthiest cities, publicly told it had let itself go in front of an audience that actually paid attention. If a town this size and this significant could end up on a list like this, you start to wonder just how deep this pattern runs across the rest of the country. Because our next entry isn't just about a failing town center. It's about the ground literally swallowing an industry. And 13 men who never made it home. Number 6. New Cumnock. New Cumnock is a small village in East Ayrshire that grew up entirely around coal. At its peak in the 1950s, its population topped 5,000 people, almost all of them tied in some way to the mines beneath the village. Today, that number sits closer to 2,600. The collieries are gone, and so, largely, is the reason the village exists at all. But New Cumnock's darkest chapter has nothing to do with an awards ceremony. On the evening of September 7, 1950, heavy rain caused a massive inrush of liquid peat and moss into the Knockshinnagh Castle colliery, flooding the underground workings and trapping 129 miners far beneath the surface. For 3 agonizing days, rescue teams worked around the clock, breaking through to a disused neighboring mine to try to reach the men before poisonous gas made the rescue route impassable. It became an international media event, cameras and reporters descending on a village most of the world had never heard of, waiting to find out how many would come out alive. In the end, 116 men were rescued, 13 were not. It remains one of the most remarkable mining rescues in British history, and one of Scotland's worst mining tragedies, remembered every year at a small commemorative cairn in the village, where the names of the 13 men are still read aloud. Decades later, in 2013, New Cumnock also collected the pluck on the plinth. Judges citing a hemorrhaging of shops and the threatened closure of both its town hall and its century-old memorial church. A village that had already survived one of the darkest days in Scottish mining history was now being told, decades later, that even its ordinary daylight streets were falling apart. If you're finding these stories heavier than you expected, that's intentional. We're only halfway through, and it does not get lighter from here. If this kind of deep dive into the towns behind the headlines is your thing, go ahead and subscribe now, because we've still got the biggest names on this list still to come. Number 5. Motherwell. Motherwell in North Lanarkshire was once nicknamed Steelopolis, the undisputed steel capital of Scotland. At the heart of that identity stood Ravenscraig, an enormous integrated steelworks that at its peak employed around 7,000 people and became, at the time of its closure, the largest hot-strip steel mill in Western Europe. Motherwell's skyline was defined by its towering blue gasometer and cooling towers, visible for miles. A constant orange glow lighting up the night sky over Lanarkshire so reliably that longtime residents later said they simply stopped noticing it, right up until the night it wasn't there anymore. Then, in January 1992, British Steel announced it was shutting the plant down. On June 24th of that year, the final slab of steel rolled off the production line. and 770 workers clocked out for the last time. A closure that rippled out to cost an estimated 10,000 jobs across the wider region. In 1996, the landmark gasometer was demolished in a matter of seconds, turning more than 1,100 acres of industrial land into one of the largest derelict brownfield sites anywhere in Europe. Motherwell never actually won the Pluk-on-the-Plinth outright, but it was shortlisted twice. In 2009 and again in 2013, judges circling back to a town still trying to figure out what it was supposed to be once the steel stopped. That kind of industrial identity doesn't just disappear when the factory closes. It leaves a hole in the shape of the thing that used to be there. And our next entry carries an even heavier kind of scar, one written by war rather than economics. Number 4. Greenock. Greenock, on the Clyde and Inverclyde, was one of Scotland's most important shipbuilding towns, which is exactly why the Luftwaffe targeted it. On the nights of May 6th and 7th, 1941, German bombers launched a sustained two-night assault on the town, aiming for its shipyards, but as in so many wartime raids, landing the heaviest toll on ordinary residential streets instead. Over those 2 nights, 271 people were killed and more than 10,000 were injured. Of 18,000 homes in the town, nearly 10,000 suffered damage and roughly 1,000 were destroyed outright. A distillery fire lit by the first wave of bombers acted as a beacon that guided the second wave straight into the heart of the town. By the time the all-clear sounded at 3:30 in the morning, much of Greenock appeared to be on fire, its sugar refineries, its distillery, and several of its churches reduced to burnt-out shells before sunrise. 3 local firemen were later awarded the George Medal for their actions that night. Greenock rebuilt as it had to, but the scars of the Greenock Blitz never fully left the town's reputation or its skyline. And in the decades since, it has repeatedly turned up on shortlists and nominations for the Pluk-on-the-Plinth, judges pointing to a town center that never quite recovered its footing after the war reshaped it. This next entry, though, isn't remembered for a single terrible night. It's remembered for becoming, twice over, the single most disliked piece of architecture in the entire United Kingdom. Number 3. Cumbernauld. Cumbernauld in North Lanarkshire is the only town in the history of the Pluk-on-the-Plinth to win the award twice, first in 2001 and again in 2005. Built from scratch starting in 1956 to relieve overcrowding in Glasgow, Cumbernaulds' population exploded from around 3,000 people to more than 23,000 within its first decade. Its centerpiece was an enormous futuristic town center building, opened by Princess Margaret in 1967, designed to combine shops, apartments, a hotel, an ice rink, a bowling alley, and even police and fire stations under one single sprawling concrete roof. Architecturally, it was genuinely ambitious for its time, later recognized internationally as a landmark of post-war design, the kind of building architecture students still study today for what it tried to accomplish. But the general public turned on it hard, and never really turned back. In 2005, in a nationwide poll run by Channel 4's program Demolition, Cumbernaulds Town Centre was voted the single most hated building in all of Britain, not just in Scotland. Not the ugliest building in one small country. The most hated building in the entire United Kingdom, chosen by the public itself. That's the kind of verdict that doesn't fade quietly. Decades later, plans are still being debated over whether to demolish the structure entirely or attempt to save it as a piece of architectural history. Cumbernauld became a case study in how a design meant to represent the future can end up representing everything people decided they hated about it instead. And that brings us to number 2. The entry I promised you at the very start. The one that didn't just embarrass a town. It ended the entire award. Number 2. Port Glasgow. Port Glasgow in Inverclyde is a 250-year-old town with a proud shipbuilding history behind it. In September 2025, after a full decade of the Pluk on the Plinth lying dormant, Urban Realm revived the award and handed it to Port Glasgow, citing the demolition of the derelict Clune Park housing estate as an example of what the magazine called squandered potential. It was meant to be presented, as it had been for 25 years, as an uncomfortable but familiar piece of civic theater. It did not go that way. At the presentation itself, a local social entrepreneur named Kevin Green refused to accept the trophy on the town's behalf, publicly denouncing the entire visit as, in his words, a poverty safari. He argued that Port Glasgow, sitting on shovel-ready regeneration plans after years of economic shocks, from the 2008 crash to the cost of living crisis, didn't need an outside magazine parachuting in to tell residents what they already knew. The confrontation made national headlines, and less than 2 weeks later, Urban Realm did something it had never done in 25 years of running this award. It scrapped the Pluk on the Plinth entirely, retiring it for good and replacing it with a new, deliberately positive award called Heart on Your Sleeve, which was handed to Port Glasgow instead. A single town's refusal to be humiliated on camera brought down an institution that had outlasted 5 different Scottish governments. That's not just a town getting a bad headline. That's a town rewriting the rules of the entire competition on its way out the door. Which brings us finally to number 1, the town that started this whole video. The one with the signpost. The one that refused to even show up. Number 1. John O'Groats. John O'Groats sits at the very northeastern tip of mainland Scotland, in the Highland Council area, and it might be the most symbolically important small settlement in the entire country. It's the traditional endpoint of the legendary Land's End to John O'Groats route, the longest point-to-point journey on the British mainland, walked, cycled, and driven by thousands of people every single year purely for the bragging rights of having covered the whole distance. Its signpost, listing the mileage to places like New York and the North Pole, is one of the most photographed roadside markers anywhere in the United Kingdom. And in 2010, out of a short list that included East Kilbride, Inverness, and Lochgilly, the judges of the Pluk on the Plinth handed John O'Groats the trophy for the most dismal town in Scotland. Their reasoning stung because it targeted the exact thing the village had built its entire identity around. Judges pointed to over-commercialization, a reliance on what they called tourist tat, and, at the time, the fact that the village was home to what was described as Britain's most northerly derelict building, an abandoned hotel sitting directly beside the famous signpost. One judge summed it up with a line that still gets quoted today. John O'Groats is a point of departure, a place for leaving Scotland behind, and it has been left behind by Scotland. The reaction from the village itself was silence. Nobody could be found willing to step forward and accept the award on John O'Groats' behalf, which is exactly how the trophy ended up passed down the list to Denny, back at number 11 on tonight's countdown. But here's the part that makes this entry the heaviest one on the whole list. That derelict hotel, the exact building judges singled out as the physical proof of the village's decline, has since been fully restored and transformed into modern holiday accommodation. The most photographed dead end in Scotland quietly rebuilt itself, without ever accepting the insult that pushed it to. It's the one entry on this entire list where the humiliation and the redemption both belong to the same building. And that's the list. 12 towns that Scotland itself, through one very strange, very stubborn 25-year-old architecture award, decided it didn't want to claim. At least not out loud. Some of them fought back. Some of them, like Port Glasgow, fought back hard enough to end the whole tradition. Some of them, like New Cumnock and Greenock, carry scars that have nothing to do with architecture at all. And one of them, sitting all the way up at number 1, spent over a decade quietly proving the judges wrong without ever saying a single word about it. Just rebuilding one derelict hotel at a time and letting the results speak for themselves. If you made it this far, you clearly like the uncomfortable, real version of these stories. So go ahead and subscribe, drop where you're watching from in the comments, and I'll see you on the next countdown.